Chapter 13 of Tractate Yevamos discusses the laws of Mion, which is that in the event that a family arranged for their minor girl to marry somebody, it's instituted that the girl, when she becomes of age and the marriage is about to go into effect, she can refuse this marriage if she wants, nullifying it completely in a process known as Mion. The first Mishnah says, Beis Shammai holds that you can only do Mion for an arusa, someone in the first stage of marriage, while Beis Hillel says you can do it while in any stage of marriage. Beis Shammai says it could be done towards a husband, while Beis Hillel says it could be done towards a husband or for Yibum, the levirate marriage. Beis Shammai says it has to be done in the husband's presence. Beis Hillel says it could be done without him. Beis Shammai says it must be done in court. Beis Hillel says it does not. Beis Hillel says she can do Mion, refusing to marry as many times as she wants. Beis Shammai says she just should do it once and then must wait until adulthood to marry. The Gemara debates the logics and sources behind these opinions, and they're all discussed further. New Mishnah. Now, all of this applies if the girl was being married off by her mother or brothers, that she can decide to refuse the marriage if it was done with her consent. If it was done without her consent, it's just not considered a legal, permissible marriage in the first place. Some say that if she's not capable of safeguarding her betrothal article, it's not permitted to marry her off. Rabbi Eliezer says if, God forbid, somebody tries to marry a minor, this is not legally binding. He has accomplished nothing. For instance, if a Yisrael's daughter is with a Kohen, she may not eat Truma, and if vice versa, she may still eat Truma, basically meaning, as stated, that the marriage is not legally acceptable or permissible, really, so nothing is accomplished legally. Some are of the opinion that if the restraint is due to him, they are considered married, and if the restraint is not due to him, they are not considered married, and it's going to explain soon what that means. The Gemara describes the exact text that's written in this Mion document of refusing such a marriage, and there are further particular cases discussed. It also describes how if a man tries to marry such a minor, as described, it's considered completely illegal and not legally binding, explaining how all of the typical laws of marriage do not apply. The opinion in regards to if it was due to restraint, which what exactly that means is debated. Some say it could mean that if someone gave her a divorce document, that's called restraint due to a man, and she's not allowed to marry his relatives or a Kohen, but if she refused him, this is restraint not due to a man, as mentioned, and she would be allowed to marry his relatives in theory, or a Kohen. This is further described. New Mishnah. If the minor refuses the husband, they're still legally allowed to marry each other's relatives, and she can still legally marry a Kohen, unlike by if he gives a divorce document. If he gives her a divorce document, asks her to remarry afterwards, and then she refuses him, then eventually marries somebody else and is widowed or divorced, she's legally allowed to marry the first husband. If she refused the first husband and then later married him, and then divorced and then married somebody else, and was then widowed or divorced, she's forbidden to remarry the first husband. Generally, if a divorce document is given at a point after Mion was done, they cannot eventually remarry, and if it's vice versa, they can. If the girl refused to marry the man and then later married somebody else and then divorced and then went to somebody else, refused him also, and then eventually married somebody, got divorced, and then refused somebody else, she's legally allowed to remarry anyone she left via Mion, but not via divorce. The Gemara discusses these points. New Mishnah. If someone divorces a woman, remarries her, and then dies childless, there's disagreement if she can do Yibum with his brother. There's also disagreement if this is done by an orphan girl. If a father marries off his daughter and she's then divorced, she is considered like an orphan, so if she's remarried by him, she cannot do Yibum. The Gemara further qualifies these points along with the logic behind the differing opinions. New Mishnah. In the event that two brothers have married two minor sisters or two deaf mutes, which are all non-biblically recognized or permitted marriages, and one of them dies, the other one cannot do Yibum or Chalitza. If one sister was an adult and the other husband died childless, the younger sister does not do Yibum or Chalitza. If the other husband dies, some say we tell the minor to refuse to marry the husband, so that way he can do Yibum. Some say she can just wait until she becomes an adult, at which point the marriage will now be recognized biblically and permitted, and the other sister won't need to do Yibum anymore as she's now a wife's sister. Others say he needs to divorce his wife and also do Chalitza. The Gemara says here it's allowed to encourage her to do Mion to allow the fulfillment of a mitzvah. This is related to an opinion which says you should cleave to Chalitza, making peace between people, and revoking vows, while staying away from Mion, accepting deposits for safekeeping, and acting as a guarantor for a loan. These points are all further expounded on. It also talks about the importance of judging properly. If somebody's a judge, and if he is, he should always view himself as if there's a sword resting between his thighs with Gehenna open beneath him, which is based on a verse. The other opinions are also discussed. This is all qualified further, and it decides we rule like the opinion that in the above case, we encourage a minor to refuse the husband, so that way they don't marry, so that way they'll separate and he can just do Yibum. New Mishnah, in the event that somebody was married to 2 orphaned female minors or 2 deaf mutes, a marriage, again, not legally recognized by biblical law or permitted, and he dies, Yibum or Chalitza with one releases the other from the requirements of Yibum and Chalitza. If he was married to one and one of those, Yibum with one does not release the other from Yibum. If he was married to a mentally competent individual and also a deaf mute, Yibum with the mentally competent woman releases the deaf mute, but not vice versa. If he was married to an adult and an orphaned minor, again, only the adult marriage being biblically recognized, Yibum with the adult releases the minor, but not vice versa. The Gemara further debates these cases. This is all discussed further, and there are additional points on these brought. New Mishnah, again, by a biblically non-recognized marriage, if somebody married 2 female minor orphans or 2 deaf mutes and died childless, and one does Yibum and then one of the brothers does Yibum also with the other one, the first one is still valid. This wouldn't apply if one was the orphan and one was the deaf mute. If one wife was mentally competent and the other was a deaf mute, if the first did Yibum and then one of the brothers did Yibum on the second, the first is still valid. With an adult woman and a minor, if they do Yibum with the adult and then the minor, the adult's Yibum is still valid. If they do Yibum with the minor and then the adult, the minor cannot be married through Yibum. Some say we instruct the minor to just refuse the marriage. The Gemara says, again, we follow the latter opinion that we instruct the minor to refuse the marriage, and this needs to be repeated as here Yibum was actually already done. New Mishnah, if a minor did Yibum with a minor, we wait until they both become adults. If a minor boy does Yibum with an adult, we also wait until he becomes an adult. If a woman, after doing Yibum, says she didn't cohabit within 30 days of them living together, we compel him to do Chalitza. If this was after, we request that he does Chalitza. If he admits he didn't cohabit, even if it's way after, we compel him to do Chalitza. If, while her husband was alive, a woman took a vow to not benefit from her brother-in-law and then finds she needs to do Yibum with him, we compel him to do Chalitza. If this vow was made after her husband died, we only request that he does Chalitza. If her intent was to avoid Yibum, then we only request for him to do Chalitza, even if it was made during her husband's life. The Gemara further clarifies these points and discusses some related ones. This goes further along with bringing some specific cases which are discussed, and there's additional qualifications on all of this. And that's the end of Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Tractate Yevamos continues discussing the law in situations of various different types of marriage. The first Mishnah says, if a deaf mute marries a mentally competent individual, as the deaf mute can't speak, when they marry or divorce, they can do so through gesturing. If a woman became a deaf mute after the marriage, they can still be married or divorced. If the woman became mentally insane after the marriage, he's not allowed to divorce her. And if the husband became a deaf mute after the marriage, he can never divorce his wife. It says a woman is different than a man here by a deaf mute, as a woman can be divorced with or without her consent, while a man can only be divorced with his consent. It also says that a woman who became a deaf mute after marriage is similar to a deaf mute girl whose father married her off, that she also can be divorced. If 2 deaf mute brothers are married to 2 deaf mute sisters, or 2 regular sisters, or to one sister who's a deaf mute and the other is mentally competent, or to 2 deaf mute sisters married to 2 regular brothers, or to 1 deaf mute brother and 1 mentally competent brother, in all these cases, if these became a widow, they're exempt from Chalitza or Yibum. If they aren't related, then the other should do Yibum. They're able to also divorce. If there are 2 brothers, one is a deaf mute and one is mentally competent, who are married to 2 competent sisters, and the deaf mute brother dies childless, the widow does not do Yibum as she's a wife's sister. If the competent brother died childless, the other must divorce his wife and can never marry anybody ever again, as he's stuck, unable to do Yibum or Chalitza. If there are 2 competent brothers married to one sister who's a deaf mute and one who's competent, if the deaf mute's husband dies childless, the other brother doesn't need to do Yibum, as the widow is his wife's sister. If the competent wife's brother died, the other must divorce his wife and do Chalitza. If there are 2 brothers, one deaf mute and the other competent, married to 2 sisters, one deaf mute, the other competent, and the deaf mute brother died, the competent brother doesn't do Yibum, as he'd be marrying his wife's sister. If the competent brother died, he must divorce his wife and can never marry for the same reasons as before. If there are 2 brothers, one deaf mute and one competent, married to 2 unrelated competent women, if the deaf mute brother dies, the other can do Yibum or Chalitza. If the competent brother dies, he must marry the widow and is never allowed to divorce her. If there are 2 competent brothers, one is married to a competent woman, the other to an unrelated deaf mute woman, and the deaf mute's husband died childless, the other should do Yibum and is allowed to divorce her later if he wants. If the other brother died, the other could do Yibum or Chalitza. If there's a deaf-mute and a competent brother married to an unrelated deaf-mute and competent woman, if the deaf-mute brother died, the other should do Yibum and is allowed to later divorce her. If the competent brother died, the other must do Yibum and can never divorce her. The Gemara says there was a rabbinically instituted category of marriage for a deaf-mute maid, as they can have normal lasting marriages, but not for an insane person, as their marriages can't function. We also said we don't institute a category of marriage for a minor boy, as unlike a deaf-mute, the boy will eventually become allowed to marry as an adult. The institutions for a girl that she can be married off by her family in the event that her father dies, with the clause that she can refuse it if she wants to, was something instituted as protection for the girl, as back in those days, at least, without her father to protect her, there was a concern that people would take advantage of her. Therefore, it was instituted that if her family consents and she doesn't refuse it, she can be married, to be put into the care of another individual. Deaf-mute women don't have miyun apply to them, as men would be deterred and don't want to marry them in the first place. There are other practical differences mentioned between the two, and there are additional cases discussed. There's also discussion if you're obligated to stop a minor from committing a sin, like if you see a child about to violate Shabbos, if you need to stop them, which is debated, and there are several proofs brought, and is further discussed. And that's the end of chapter 14.